The conference has been muted.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar entitled Strategic Planning is Dead, Don't Do It. And for those of you who have known me for a long time, and I know there's a few folks that are listening in on this webinar that have known me for a long time, you know, Debbie Thompson and strategic planning have been synonymous for about 20 years. It's hard to believe that somebody who would be so apt to talk about strategic planning, and I've been an advocate for it for so long, has gotten to the point in my career that I've become a cynic about it. And, you know, my cynicism is actually driven by the fact that I, to some degree, am a frustrated idealist. And I have really been evaluating closely the things that our clients have found that have been working and not working. And I found that the elements of what people consider to be typical strategic planning don't really work anymore. And they don't work at all. So I feel like I've got to come up with a new language for what is strategic planning really, and what we should be doing in today's environment. And so what I said is, don't do strategic planning the way we typically have thought about it. You want to create an agenda of work for transformational change instead. And what I've been hearing from our clients as we've talked about this, especially over the last few months, what we're finding is our clients are feeling that they are their organizations are either in need of complete transformation in many ways, or what I'll call better adaptability, or in some cases, the ability to improve their adaptability as an organization. So the objectives of today's session are, you know, first of all, to determine if strategic planning is or ever was alive and well. And by that, I'm talking about specifically assessing the effectiveness of your organization's strategic planning and organizational development process, and then looking at that and evaluating what you're doing and how you're doing it, and identifying the barriers to effective organizational development. Because whether planning works or not in your organization has everything to do with, do you have a strong enough evaluative process where you're looking at what's working and what's not working, and then figure out how to get to where you need to go. And then I'm going to help you and give you some techniques to identify those barriers to effective organizational development, because I've seen a variety of them over the last 15 years. And then to identify strategies to create that agenda of work for transformational change. And in some organizations' cases, that's what sustainability is all about. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So as we get started, for those of you who are not really familiar with Strategy Solutions, I start off with a little bit of commercial and give you a little, some point of view from where we come from. The mission of our company is to create healthy communities. And we've done a lot of work in helping private sector wealth creating companies work with communities and governments and with social service sectors, because healthy communities are created at the intersection of those strong, vibrant sectors all working together to improve the health of a population and to create a healthier community. We also believe in healthy organizations. And healthy organizations are those that have strong product development and manufacturing and service delivery. They actually do what they say they're going to do and deliver the products and services they say they're going to do. They also have strong finance, which is financial management and access to capital. And if they're a nonprofit organization, they also have strong fundraising. And they also have solid support services, which are things like marketing, IT, HR, the back office operations that make things work. And as we've been evaluating our work in our own organizations and what we are doing and not doing and should be doing, Strategy Solutions has gone through a period probably in the last 6 months where we've had somewhat of our own existential crisis. And mostly because as we look at creating strategic plans and coming to the conclusion that in some cases strategic planning isn't working, what are we really doing? And after listening to our clients and to people who know us and know our work well, what we really do at Strategy Solutions has more to do with helping people connect their vision to results and outcomes and impact of what they're doing than it has to do with strategic planning. So I'm trying to distance myself from those words, believe it or not, and talk to people about what we're really doing when we're working with them. And we're typically doing 3 things. First of all, we're assessing the gap between where they are and where they want to be. In many cases, as we go through the action planning process, we're filling the gaps immediately through what I'll call best practice role modeling, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then we're helping to align the organization from top to bottom, because when everybody is all on the same page and everyone is aligned, wonderful things in an organization start to happen spontaneously, regardless of whether or not the strategic plan is written down and there's a 200-page document or even a detailed project or action plan to accomplish something. So in my mind, a good plan is a written representation of what's in the hearts and minds of the people who are working together. We just have to, the outcome is really to create that alignment and the commitment to really work together. So what are we doing? When we start working on a strategic planning process or whatever we're doing with a client, we really try to look at what are they trying to accomplish? Is the vision clear? What is their vision of what they want to do? In some cases, we're working on what I call the project from hell. We're working on, and actually I'm going to stop for a minute and tell a little story. We're actually working on updating our website, and the guy that's helping us update our website said, you got to actually have a page to talk about the project from hell, because some of the most important change processes that we've done is because a CEO sat down and said, I have a problem I need to solve, and I have an initiative I want to accomplish, and I have no idea how to do it. And they've called us, and we figured out how to put together the right combination of education and group process to get that CEO the outcome they wanted. So what are we doing? We're assessing the gap between where they are and where they want to be, and we're looking at their vision, whether it's the CEO's or a leadership team's vision or a leadership team and board's vision and the reality. What is real today and what is their vision? And is that vision clear? Is it concise? Is it compelling? And most importantly, is anybody going to buy it? Especially for nonprofit organizations, does somebody care about what they want to try to do? The second thing we're looking at is life cycle stage and the maturity of the organization. And when I talk about maturity, I'm not talking about chronological age, but I'm talking about the maturity of all of the capacity functions in order for an organization to be sustainable. And I will talk about those. We're also looking at the organization's current capacity and capacity for growth and process gaps and skill gaps. And if an organization is stuck and it can't seem to do the thing it wants to do or can't get something done, what I've found over the years is there's some process or skill gap or both there that's not being addressed. And then once we look at that, we're going to help the group develop a plan, whether it's a project plan, a strategic plan, or whatever, to achieve their vision. But it's not just the stuff they want to do. It includes how do they have to get there, including addressing the life cycle needs and the capacity needs that they may have that before we started working they may not even recognize exist. And that's a lot of the problem. The other thing we'll do is as we work on the action planning, we'll fill in those process and skill gaps immediately through best practice role modeling. And what I found with many organizations that don't have well-established planning or financial planning functions, we actually end up teaching the staff members how to do what my former boss called completed staff work. And we're teaching and coaching that. but we're starting to recognize that what we're doing is we're actually project managing a change management process for the CEO, that we're looking at unfreezing the past, we're changing, creating a new set of behaviors, and then we're refreezing in a new model. In some cases, we're merely being the accountability helper for the team. We're also busy doing our day jobs unless somebody is in our face going, where is this? Here's your deadline, get it done. People aren't doing it. In some cases, we're teaching and coaching completed staff work. In other cases, we're doing first, then we're teaching and coaching. And my favorite example of that is setting up an outcomes measurement process for somebody. That's a technical skill that many nonprofit organizations don't have. And we'll actually set that process up and then teach people how to do it, teach the staff how to do it and maintain it. In some cases, we'll utilize outside expertise of other consultants that have technical skills that we might not have, or management service volunteers, which are board members who have particular skills. We also challenge staff to go the extra mile to fill capacity gaps. And what do I mean by that? Oftentimes when people do a strategic plan, they say, well, we have to hire people to do this or that. Well, and I challenge that assumption. What we have found is that oftentimes the people that they would hire, or they do hire staff, that staff is there for a year, 18 months, doesn't accomplish anything, and then leaves. I've seen that so many times. So what we're doing is we're encouraging our clients to challenge that assumption, have their current staff go the extra mile to try to get a little bit more done and build the capacity until we figure out what do you really need staff to do, what needs to be in their job descriptions and performance expectations, and then hire somebody to do it. Because without all of those things in place, often incremental staff is hired and it doesn't really change anything. And then we align the organization, board and management, the management team itself, management and staff, and the entire, again in a nonprofit, the system, internal system, and donors, to make sure that donors will actually support the things that that nonprofit wants to do. So now I want to see if my polling feature works. Which of the following best describes you, for those of you who are on the phone? You got to click on these little radio buttons work, and I hope they do. Click on the item that best describes you. Are you a manager or director level staff? Are you an executive director or a CEO? Are you a staff member, or are you other? I'm going to try to use my little polling feature here to help support this process, and I hope it works. So go ahead and vote if you can. Okay, here we go. We have some executive directors or CEOs, some staff members, some manager or director level staff. Great. Gives you a little bit of idea who our group is. So here's the question, is strategic planning really dead? Our planning process looks at, very simply, where are we now, where do we want to be, how are we going to get there, who's going to do what, and how are we doing? And those questions are generally, you would think, pretty easy to ask and answer. But what I found is that many organizations shortcut some of those pieces of the process and don't really do them all fully, even when we're working with them, believe it or not. In some cases, there's just not capacity to do it. In some cases, there's just not interest to do it. And the place where I see the most shortcutting often done is in the how are we doing part, in the evaluation of, are we really doing what we said we were going to do? And if we're not doing it, why aren't we? So I'm going to systematically unpack these various pieces for you and start to think about it. I love this slide because many of us are little pussycats looking in the mirror thinking that we're lions. And if we're really honest about our own assessment, and we look at and say, how effective is our strategic planning and organizational development process, we shouldn't be looking in the mirror and seeing a lion if we're really a pussycat. But here's the questions that you want to ask yourself and answer as you move forward to look at that. The first thing you have to do is be willing and able to challenge your assumptions. We have to challenge our assumptions about what we believe we think we know. This is absolutely a critical success factor, because I found if we don't challenge our assumptions, it makes it very difficult for us to move forward. So here's my next question for you. How would you rate your organization's ability to implement your strategic plan? And I actually have 5 radio buttons on the next slide, but what I realized as I prepared for this presentation today that all of the words that I have on the page here were not able to be cut and pasted into the question feature of ReadyTalk. So if you think about this, if you say, what plan? We don't have a plan, press the top button. If you have trouble creating momentum for your plan and you have goals for your plan or goals and objectives and the plan sits on the shelf, press the second button. If you've implemented some, press the third. If you've done most of them, press the fourth, and if you've implemented all of them, press the fifth, and you're wildly successful. So how would you rate your organization's ability to implement your plan? If you're having trouble with it, the plan's on the shelf. That's the second option. If you've implemented some, press the third option. If you've implemented most, press the next option. And if you've implemented all, the last. And this is interesting, and it's actually your own responses to this is what tells me strategic planning is dead, okay? No one on our call today has implemented all of their strategic planning results. The most effective organizations say they've implemented the most. Many people say that they've implemented some, but for the most part, either we don't have a plan at all or we got stuff sitting on the shelf. What the heck is going on? And why is it that our organizations aren't achieving the things that we set out to do? I am starting to raise that question because I see a core set of issues that are emerging that we're really not addressing. And this is designed to do it. So you have to ask yourself, does your company have one or more goals that didn't get accomplished? Are you frustrated because you can't get to certain things? Or are you frustrated because you can't seem to deal with the elephant in the room, all of which suggests that you have perhaps process or skill gaps that you're not addressing. In some cases, how do we do planning? This is, we pull out the crystal ball and we say, it's time to restore cuts to our budget. And that's our way of doing planning, but that's really not the answer. And in most cases, the way planning works is just really ineffective. It doesn't really help us. The classic concept of strategy, we match our organization to the business environment. We say, how are we operating? What are we doing? The problem with this approach is that the environment is changing way too rapidly for us to keep up. Many people focus on SWOT analysis. What are our strengths and weaknesses, our opportunities and threats? And we look at top management value, we look at the internal context and the external environment. And even the problem with SWOT analysis is that we are only looking at the served market when we do SWOT analysis. We're looking at only we're talking to the people who know us. We're not talking to the people who don't know us that might be revealing to us what we don't know about what we're missing. And that's really a critical thing. Or we do this, which is one of the things that drives me crazy when I read somebody's strategic plan. Why does a plan fail? Because we write a plan that has an objective that says we're going to write a plan? Really? That tells me that the implementation planning process isn't working in your plan, because no one should have an objective on their plan that they're going to develop a fundraising plan. If you have an effective implementation management process, you should be figuring out the human capital and operating resources required to implement your plan and saying, okay, we can fund 30% of this through cash from operations. We can take on debt for some percentage of it, and for another percentage of it, we need to fundraise and make a case for support for that. And we put a fundraising budget on what we can't fund out of operations. That's your fundraising goal. And people say, well, we're going to do that later. It never happens. So why do plans fail? This is based on our experience. First of all, there's a lack of understanding of what it takes to get to the next level. The implementation plan is either unrealistic or it's non-existent. People really haven't thought through what it's going to take to do what they need to do. The third reason is that return on investment and impact is not quantified, so there's no case for support for fundraising. It's really hard to do fundraising when you don't have a case for support. It's really hard. Lack of buy-in alignment. People are not on the same page. I've also found that there's a lack of capacity and technical skill, in some cases a capability, which in many cases, these are the things that are missing. There's no one on the management team has good project management skills or facilitation skills, and or dealing with the naysayers, which is conflict resolution or conflict management skills. Those are the two skill sets that I see most often missing in organizations that are stuck. I also see this happen. We blame one or more individuals for lack of performance without recognizing the root cause. Sometimes it isn't the people, it's the process. And total quality management thinking teaches us it's the process, not the people. Yet I see many organizations blame a person for not doing something when they're really not looking at the overall system. And then here's the biggest one, the inability to admit that one or more of the above is a problem and getting help to work through it. Because, as most people know, that you can't accomplish something unless you recognize that you need to accomplish it and actually set that as a goal. So I'm going to talk about each one and why is it challenging for folks to really think about getting to the next level. So before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about these life cycle stages and ask you to tell me which stage of the organizational life cycle your organization's in. I have them labeled here. That one is in the startup mode, 2 is in the transition from startup to adolescence, 3 is an adolescent organization that has started to decline before it's fully got into adolescence. We sometimes work with small to medium-sized nonprofits that have a staff of 1 to 6 or 10 people. They can't figure out how to grow beyond that. That's an organization, and they decline before they get there. That's an organization that's stuck in that transition between startup and adolescence. And then we see folks that are getting toward maturity where they may hit the limits to growth and they start to decline. I've seen organizations that are starting to stagnate. It could be a $50 million organization that's starting to stagnate before it reaches full maturity because it doesn't have some of the systems in place that it needs. So that would be a 6. We see organizations at what I have labeled as 5. They're in sustain mode. They're doing pretty well. They know they need to get to the next level, but they're not quite there yet. And then we see organizations that are actively building that new curve. And then we see organizations that are in decline that their board and their management team is saying, well, maybe we ought to close the doors. So here's my labels. Startup, transition to adolescence, declining before adolescence, adolescence striving to maturity is 4, 5 is sustaining, starting to build a new curve, 6 is declining before maturity, 7 is actively building, 8 is declining. So I'm going to ask you on the next slide to pick which one of those numbers represents your organization. So go ahead and pick. Which stage of the life cycle are we in? Can I go back one slide? Sure, I can go back one slide. There's the numbers again. And when I went back, it actually pulled it for me, so I apologize for that. Here's our results. So we see people in different stages of the life cycle, which is, typical. People are in different places. But again, we're not really looking at what does it take to get to that next level, regardless of where we are. If we're in adolescence, we've got to figure out how to get to maturity. If we are at 5 or 6 where we're not quite to maturity or we're needing to build that new curve, what do we do? Okay? It's a step function to get up to that next level, and you really have to put extra investment to get to that next level of infrastructure. It's not an organic decision. It's actually, you have to make an intentional decision and some investment to get up to that next level. How do you do that? And how do you figure out how to get there? Well, first of all, one of the things you have to think about is the roles board in planning and oversight. And it's not sitting under the table like this. And many board members will start to think about, where do we go? So let me ask you this question. For those of you who are nonprofit organizations on the call, or even for-profit organizations, because we've worked with a number of organizations in the last few years that are for-profit organizations that have a governing board. How effective is your board at supporting the strategic direction of your organization? Is it very effective? Is it somewhat effective? Is it not effective? This is interesting, okay? Because I oftentimes see people more often see the majority of people in the somewhat effective realm. And, part of the problem with boards is that they evaluate their own effectiveness like this. They sit around and say, we do one of these 5 things. We're either brilliant, we're doing extremely well, we're stunning, or outstanding. But part of the problem is that many boards don't know what their roles ought to be. And what I found from listening to some of our clients and others recently is that in some cases we can't even, as staff members, can't even raise the question about board effectiveness because it's politically incorrect to do so, which I found fascinating. And as a result of that, I've become such a champion for the standards for excellence in nonprofit ethics and accountability, and encouraging board members to read those and to learn about them, because it's really part of their governance role to make sure that the capacity exists for their nonprofit organization to be able to do all of those things. And if an organization is for-profit, they have to still do all of those things from a capacity perspective. And we also have to be thinking about, are we at a mature level? And in order to be considered mature in the stage of the organizational life cycle, you have to have fully in place these 4 components of capacity. You have to have adaptive capacity, leadership, management, and technical capacity. And leadership capacity is the ability to monitor, assess, respond to, and stimulate internal and external changes. Management capacity is the effective and efficient use of resources. Adaptive capacity is I misspoke. Adaptive capacity is the ability to monitor, assess, respond to, and stimulate change. Leadership capacity is the ability of leadership and staff to inspire, prioritize, make decisions, and innovate. And technical capacity is the ability to implement all the functions and deliver products and services. And what I found is that organizations that struggle on one or more dimensions, I talk about the process and the skill gaps, most of the trouble that folks have, I pinpointed project management and conflict resolution skills as skill gaps. The other things that are gaps are these adaptive capacity gaps. Staff members don't have the ability to do the technical functions related to adaptive capacity. And it's these things: product development planning, outreach and advocacy, outcomes measurement and program evaluation, earned income generation, compliance and quality. This list, I've been growing this list. When I first started this list about 6 years ago, the number of technical things on it was about 8. And the top 6 that are on here today weren't even on my list 6 years ago. So this gives you a sense of what's been changing in terms of expectations and what is becoming more challenging for organizations to build the capacity for, because our organizations are engineered to do the products and service we offer today. They're not necessarily engineered to really adapt to the future. And that's part of the reason why planning doesn't work, because much of the planning, much of the assumptions that go into planning is that we have to do the work that we need to do with the resources that we have. We don't really think about how do we get the resources that we need. And the most significant challenge today is that training and capacity building alone, or what I'll call gap-filling consulting projects, are not going to be sufficient for either. It doesn't matter if you're a nonprofit or a for-profit to address these technical needs. This is why young entrepreneurs go to the Shark Tank, because it's not just about the money. It's about that capacity and connection related to the skill sets of operating at a higher level. And organizations need to build capacity in each of the areas if they're going to be sustainable. So let me ask you this question. How equipped do you feel your organization's technical capacity is, given that list of 15 things I just showed you? And oh, by the way, this is probably a good time for me to mention, because I didn't mention it before, that each one of you will get a copy of the slide deck from today's presentation, along with an article that I wrote for our newsletter, if you haven't received it already, on this topic and some of the strategies that we've found actually work to help people get to the next level. You'll be getting those after today's session emailed to you. This is interesting. Again, we see most people somewhat equipped. We're not fully equipped. But, what do we do then? And what I'm challenging our clients now to think about is you have to ask yourself the question, how sustainable is your business model? And this becomes the defining question. And my work with a $475 million health system that really didn't have the technical capacity or the purchasing power to generate enough cash for strategic investment on its own without affiliating with the UPMC or equivalent, then how does a small to medium-sized organization have a sustainable business model? Chances are we don't. And this comes back to challenging the assumptions. It comes back to challenging the assumptions that says maybe we don't have a sustainable business model. We have to think about it, because most companies struggle with those technical capacity items, what I call 6 to 15, and don't begin to address 1 to 5. How does a small to medium-sized organization do it if they struggle with the basics? And here's the challenge that I throw out to all small to medium-sized organizations. First of all, what's so attractive about a UPMC? And I like to use them as an example, especially in Western Pennsylvania, because a lot of people are familiar with UPMC, and they either love them or hate them. And more people are on the hate side because of the command and control leadership style. But you can't argue with the cost savings from the joint purchasing power, the standardization of best practices within programs, or the management systems that decrease cost and improve quality and outcomes. You got to think like a franchise, like McDonald's. They have their processes standard. Cost savings derive from consolidating back office operations and the technical capacity areas that are expensive to replicate. Access to specialists and capital dollars. But here's the important thing. 80% of something is better than 100% of nothing if the alternative is going out of business. And this is the key question that I encourage every small organization to think about. Can we figure out how to build a collaborative corporate support model that allows programs, and this could be for-profit businesses, because the ones that I talk about here are for-profit businesses, to retain their individual brand identity, such as Pepsi, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and Kentucky Fried Chicken, but allows them to benefit from cost savings, strong back office operations, and technical expertise. And my company is actually an example where virtual collaboration can make a big difference. My Erie office and actually my Pittsburgh office, both offices are housed in with other organizations. And here in our Erie office, we're actually co-located with WQLN Public Television and Radio. And what's important about this, I had somebody come to an education program that we did last week, and it hadn't dawned on them that us located here in this building with the nonprofit partnership provide a rich educational hub environment, not to mention that my costs are significantly lowered because my landlord here is allowing us to use their telephone infrastructure and their IT infrastructure. So because we have a bulk purchasing rate with the IT company that takes care of all of us, I'm paying about 25% of what I would pay on the open market if I had to hire a Velocity network on my own. And I have no cost now for telecommunications because we're using the telecommunication systems here. There are all sorts of opportunities for other organizations, for-profit and nonprofit, to benefit from relationships like that without ever having to go down the path of a merger. Nobody's accusing us of merging. We're not talking about that, although maybe someday we might. But in the meantime, we're figuring out how to work together, and we're sharing services. The Chief Operating Officer at WQLN is actually our Acting Director of Finance, and I'm actually their Acting Director of Planning, and we are swapping services with each other to help create that environment. Money's not changing hands. So it's an interesting way to do it. So how do we really start to bridge these gaps? First of all, you've got to look at the process or skill gaps in your organizations that are barriers to your effectiveness. And we're not thinking about that when we do our evaluation. And I think we have to start. And this isn't planning, okay? And maybe it's not you, but maybe there's something going on that you don't know and could do something about if you were aware of it. And here's where asking a lot of questions makes a lot of sense, because sometimes you miss the obvious. Sometimes I miss the obvious. And you have to go to people who are willing to be honest with you about what you don't know, and listen for the answers. That's an important thing. And that's actually an important thing that a consultant can bring to an organization if leadership is willing to listen to the results. The other thing you have to do is you have to recognize what I'll call the stages of change model. The little rubric on the right of this slide actually talks about the stages of change. And people will often not change unless they see a reason to change. And for many people, depending on their personality, they're not going to change just because they don't, especially in today's world when they're really busy and they've got a million things screaming at them. If there isn't a compelling reason to do something different, they're just going to do the next thing that's screaming at them because they don't have capacity to think beyond that. And I don't criticize people that are in that space because our organizations, compared to the way they were 20 years ago, are so lean that we don't have the capacity to fool around anymore. So we have to be really thinking about and make sure that people, first of all, understand that there's a compelling enough reason that they become emotionally invested into some kind of action, and that there is some kind of reward or some kind of positive benefit or impact of that action, or people aren't going to get on the bus to change. Now, what are some strategies to increase that effectiveness? First of all, you want to create an environment where board and staff members can be honest about individual and collective performance without excuses, defensiveness, or a fear of retribution, so they can walk through the issues. And the way I like to do that is I will actually put people in a room together and say, give yourselves a grade on your strategic planning accomplishments. If we graded ourselves the way we would do in school, would you give us an A, a B plus, a B, C plus, C, D, or F? Most people rate themselves somewhere between a B and a B plus. That's the highly effective ones. And then ask questions. What's missing? What would it take to give ourselves an A if we were going to grade our performance a year from now or 3 years from now? What are those things that we're missing that are not part of what we're doing? It's in the answer to that question, or that series of questions, that you're really going to figure out how to fill in the gap. Most strategic planning processes don't ask those questions, and you have to be able to do it. The second thing that you have to do is you have to synthesize and distill vision elements into a shared vision through discussion and dialogue. You know, it's like, the way I liken it is that, you know, most CEOs have a vision of where the organization's going without it ever being written down. And depending on where people are in the process, it's like they'll hear one thing and they think that's the vision, but it's only a piece of it. And other people have a piece of the vision. You have to really sit down and take the time for everybody to create shared understanding of where you are, what it means, where you want to go, and how to do that. And that process can't be shortcutted. You have to take the time to really think about what piece of the vision does everybody have, can they create consensus and agreement, and can they commit to it? That's really important. You also want to engage stakeholders through effective outreach and inquiry, data collection, effectively summarizing data to draw conclusions about stakeholder needs and expectations to change. Because without that, you're not going to be able to shape new programs or products. And I'm going to stop for a second and tell a story about a testimonial I got from one of our client CEOs. And I wish I would have had a video recorder so that he could put it on tape, because a couple of years ago I helped the organization who really didn't believe that they could raise new money. They really felt that they didn't, you know, there wasn't, funding was being cut. They couldn't raise money for new programs. They couldn't make a case for support. And I'm like, trust me, if we really spend the time, if we sit down and really think through what's it going to cost what's it going to take, the human capital and operating resources to really make this program work. Because many of their leaders were caught up in our funding streams won't pay for this and they won't pay for that. Well, what would it take to fill in the gaps of all those programs? We, through a lot of coaching and a lot of support, actually got them to spend the time that they felt they didn't have to figure out what it was going to cost to do it, including the human capital and operating resources. They made a case for support, and this organization raised over $4 million of new money to fund program gaps and other things that they needed, that the CEO said to me, we would have never been able to do that without you really showing us that that process was possible. And I'm like, wow. And it was a pretty sizable organization, but that's a good example of it could make a difference. You also have to encourage vetting concerns. And I've seen this more often than not. Because we don't have good conflict resolution skills in our organizations, people will bring up a concern. Most times it's a legitimate concern. It's not like people are blowing smoke or they're just deliberately trying to be disagreeable. But they have a concern. And instead of looking at the concerns, voicing them, and addressing them, they'll let the concern stop the process. Because somewhere, and I've had board members talk about this, somewhere boards think and management team thinks we have to have 100% agreement to something before we can move forward. So we spend a lot of time turning on things until we get complete agreement, which we really don't need. We need the majority. We need a tipping point. We need the critical mass of people to agree, and we also have to be able to address the concerns that are brought up, because more often than not, the people that bring up the concerns are detail-oriented people that want to make sure all the ducks are in a row before we go and do something potentially stupid that we're going to regret later. So we have to know and understand those things and recognize them and respect them, make them part of the planning process, and then continue to move forward with them. The other thing we have to do is look again at the human capital and operating resources required to achieve tangible outcomes. But again, here's one of the skill gaps. I have worked with many middle and upper management folks in organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, who really don't have the skill, they don't have the knowledge to say what's it going to take. They don't know how to do the research to think through. It would take 3 people 5 hours to do this, and then it would take another person an hour and a half to do this, and it would take somebody in finance 2 hours to do this, and really think through the cost accounting that it would take to make something happen. And that's not a criticism. An organization shouldn't criticize the program director or the administrator who can't do that. You ought to get them help to figure out how to do the research to get the cost associated with doing something that would be required to achieve a tangible outcome. The other thing I found, and I've started talking about this out loud, the financial planning process must include cash flow forecasting. And many nonprofit CFOs actually don't know how to do this. They don't do 3-year cash flow forecasting. They never learn how. They don't know how. They don't do cost benefit and return on investment analysis. That's just not something they do. They don't know how to explain to the finance committee of the board that we're developing a new program or we're implementing a new program. So $60,000 of what's not on our bottom line is actually tied up in working capital in this program that we'll see revenue for in 6 months from now, but we don't see revenue today. All of that financial planning has to be done in order to make good transformational change. And in some cases, the accounting department simply doesn't know how to do that. And over the years, and I try to be quiet about this, I've coached a lot of CFOs in how to think that way. I've even taught some of them how to do financial forecasting. The other thing that has to be done in real time is trade-off analysis. You know, which is more important, this or this? And are we going to stop doing certain things in order to do more of something else? And if something is marginally effective, do we know how to do an actual margin analysis? Is there a contribution margin to this thing? Because if there's not a contribution margin to a program or a product that is being offered, we really should eliminate it. And having that conversation based on the numbers, if you don't have the numbers, you can't do that anecdotally. Your financial planning process really needs to have those in place, and the organization will have trouble if it doesn't. And you have to be able to sequence those strategic investments, develop the case for support, and seek working capital resources. And keep in mind that most funders today, some funders won't fund working capital. They'll fund the ongoing cost of something, but they won't fund the startup. And you have to figure out how to generate that cash for strategic investment or raise it from what I'll call venture philanthropy. Explain to a donor, if you're a nonprofit, to fund these things, the startup of these things, so that we can get revenue from it down the road. And if you can't do any of those things or don't have the ability to put any of those things in place and set fundraising goals around those marginal investments that you need to create that long-term sustainability, you may not, in fact, have a sustainable business model. And what you should be doing is admitting it and looking for ways to collaborate. Now, here's one of my next questions. How innovative do you feel your organization is? Do you feel your organization is very innovative? Is it somewhat innovative, or is it not innovative? Because this is the other area where I see many people struggling. It's hard to be innovative. And actually, there's evidence in the literature. Let me go back to this. Here's your responses. None of you said very innovative. I'm not surprised. It's hard to be innovative because our organizations are structured to do the work that they do today, not to what they should be doing in the future. And I encourage you to read this book, if you haven't read it yet, called How Stella Saved the Farm, because it's one of those fable books. And Stella's really a sheep. That's a picture of her there holding up a picture of an alpaca. And you have to be able to assess the capabilities of your organizations to do innovation. And the thing that I like about the Stella book is it actually explains a model of how innovation can be operated in existing organizations. Some people believe you can only start new organizations, but there are the two Dartmouth professors that actually wrote the book, How Stella Saved the Farm, actually wrote another book called The Other Side of Innovation, which described how organizations can actually bridge that gap between committing to an innovative idea and making an innovation happen, because you can't do it. And they have lots of evidence why you can't do it in the current structures of your organization. The Stella book explains it well. It explains why you can't produce alpaca wool off a sheep farm, okay? But here's the essence of it. Your performance engine is designed to do certain things, and it's designed to do the business that you do every day. In order to have an innovation initiative actually work, you have to dedicate some resources to that task. You don't have to hire a fully vetted new team, and you can actually dedicate time of certain staff members to do this. And I've worked with numerous organizations that have figured out how to embed this thinking in their leadership team culture so that they create this a partnership between the dedicated team and shared staff members who help support the innovation initiative. And they're very successful and help get innovation happening in their organization much faster simply by using the innovation principles that are outlined in these books. And we build these things into our implementation processes. This is not strategic planning. And you also have to think about developing management systems. And as organizations grow, many don't invest in the systems required for continued growth. We had a client come to us a couple of years ago that was actually referred to us from the Forbes Fund in Pittsburgh, who said, we're running an $18 million organization on a $1 million management structure. Help us. And they had never clarified appropriate supervisory levels or span of control. They hadn't appropriately documented policies, procedures, training managers how to problem solve or adhere to them. And they haven't done anything in terms of any type of succession planning. People were just doing stuff. Now, the lack of those systems will show up in increased turnover and middle management burnout. But there are ways to develop those management systems, and there's ways to implement those expectations. We encourage your organizations, if you don't have that infrastructure, to really think about it. And it comes back to challenge those staff members to go the extra mile to fill in those gaps of the short-term staffing needs so you can redesign work or make an actual business case for additional investment. And in some cases, when teams feel stuck, it's simply because they don't have good role clarification of where one process starts and another process ends across departments. It's usually that simple. And they're, believe it or not, too polite because we don't want to have conflict to talk about it. And what's interesting is the avoidance of the discussion actually creates more conflict and more problems down the road. But somehow they justify continuing to be that way because they perceive it's too hard to do it. So you just have to recognize, you have to recognize the cultural iceberg that's there. We see structure and systems, but underneath it is trust and values and perceptions and attitudes and feelings that we may not be recognized that are really important sometimes to our organization. And one of the strategies related to this, and I saw this very effectively in an organization that I dealt with, they actually organized the leadership team to do conflict resolution and employee development planning in effective ways. And I asked people, do you have people on your team who actually help to unruffle feathers, okay? Because there are times when, leaders need to have their feathers unruffled and deal with the conflict moving forward. Some organizations are good at it, some aren't. But I encourage the leadership teams to actually specify roles for being involved in conflict resolution. And in some cases, we've encouraged people to rewrite job descriptions to include accountabilities and expectations, because you cannot expect people to do what is not in their job description. I have found that to be the case in many organizations we've worked with. The supervisors and managers are expected to do certain things, but it's not written in their job description, and some people are very literal about that. And in many cases, I found this to be true. Performance evaluation systems, managers are responsible for administering the business that they already have. They're not expected to achieve outcomes and impact. You should revise your performance evaluation systems to do that. And lastly, and probably not leastly, is you also have to develop an agenda of work for your board and its committees that align with and support these key strategic investments and support the work of the organization. Because I've often found that boards work at cross purposes with management, not because they intentionally do so, but it just works out that way sometimes because they don't know and understand their role, they don't know what good board governance means, they don't understand the role in planning, and sometimes they just need to be educated. And it's not the executive director or the CEO that's able to do that. So in summary, is strategic planning dead, or was it simply never really alive and well? And here's the conclusion that I come to: it really doesn't matter, because the more important thing is to assess whether your organization is experiencing those process and or skill gaps that are barriers to goal accomplishment. I don't care what you call it. It's really not strategic planning. It's, I don't know, organizational evaluation. But it doesn't matter. The best thing that you could do for yourselves is to look at where you're stuck, look at the process gaps and skill gaps, and take action. Use some of the strategies that I just laid out for you, and hopefully you will find a better way to move your organization forward. And with that, I will stop for questions. And I will unmute
the conference has been unmuted.
If any of you want to ask questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
I was just finishing up a webinar on something like
heart disease is the leading
Any
killer
questions?
of the United States every year. Don't be another victim of heart disease. Take charge by making healthier choices to lower your risk. Eat a healthy diet with fruits, veggies, and lean protein. Include physical
Anybody have any questions?
basic routines, even if it's only for 15 minutes. And finally, don't smoke. For more ways to lower your risk for heart disease, speak with your physician.
Anybody have any questions?
Debbie, it's Ed Lesser. It's a lot of information to digest in a very short time.
I've been accused of that.
Know that having
Like hitting people with a fire hose of information. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you have diabetes, it's important to keep close track.
We're getting a pre-recorded message over on sound.
Right.
Set reasonable goals for improving them. Incorporate a low-fat, low-sodium diet and 30 minutes of daily exercise into your routine. And quit smoking today. For more tips, visit
Anyone have any questions? I am going to.
This is Mary Ellen. I'm echoing Ed's comment. This was very, very good, and it's just a lot to take in. I'm looking forward to looking through the slide program again, and possibly talking further.
Right, and I'm happy, and actually I'd be happy to do, and I didn't say this while I still had the recording on, but I'm happy to do this presentation either via webinar or in person, for anybody who would like me to do it. I just ask, if it's someplace I have to travel to, I just ask the organization to pay the travel expenses, because I'm just a big believer in we got to get the word out for people to start thinking about and digesting what they need to do differently. So I'd be happy to chat with you further, Mary Ellen, or anyone that is listening.
Thank you. I will pass that along to my successor.
Has somebody been hired for your job, Ed? I knew you were searching.
They've identified somebody, but asked not to make it public yet.
Okay.
And it's a very, very fine person.
Well, excellent. Glad to hear that. Well, and you have some pretty big shoes to fill.
They seem to be shrinking.
Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know about that, but
I'm going to check out.
okay.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Yes, bye-bye. And I'm happy if anyone has any questions after they start to think about and digest this, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. So with that, I'm going to sign off and thank you for joining and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Debbie.